The grand ballroom of Bellevue Palace glittered under 1,000 crystal chandeliers as Berlin's elite gathered for what would become one of the most talked about state banquets in recent memory. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier had spared no expense in welcoming the British royal family on their official state visit to Germany. The evening was meant to celebrate the strong diplomatic ties between the two nations, but it would end up creating headlines for entirely different reasons. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, moved gracefully through the crowd in an elegant midnight blue gown that caught the light perfectly. Her sapphire and diamond tiara, on loan from the royal collection, sparkled as she engaged in conversation with various dignitaries. Every gesture she made seemed effortless, every smile genuine, and the German guests appeared completely charmed by her presence. She had that rare quality that made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room when she spoke to them. Queen Camilla stood across the room, resplendent in emerald green silk and her late mother-in-law's emerald parure. As the queen consort, protocol dictated that she should be the center of attention at such events. She had worked hard over the years to win public acceptance, transforming from the woman once blamed for breaking up a fairy tale marriage into a respected royal who carried out her duties with dedication and grace. The tension between the two women wasn't obvious to casual observers, but those who knew the royal family well could sense an underlying current. It wasn't personal animosity exactly, but rather the natural friction that comes when two strong women occupy overlapping spaces in the same institution. Camilla had earned her position through patience and perseverance, while Catherine represented the future of the monarchy in a way that sometimes overshadowed the present. President Steinmeier made his way between the guests, ensuring everyone felt welcome. He had been looking forward to this evening for months, carefully crafting his speech to honor both the visiting royals and the relationship between their countries. As a former diplomat himself, he understood the delicate balance required when hosting members of another nation's royal family. Every word would be analyzed, every gesture scrutinized. The British ambassador to Germany, Sir Sebastian Wood, watched nervously from the sidelines. State visits were his responsibility, and he knew how quickly things could go wrong if protocol wasn't followed precisely. He had briefed the president's team extensively on royal protocol, emphasizing the importance of treating both royal ladies with equal respect and attention. The last thing anyone wanted was a diplomatic incident over perceived slights. As dinner was announced, the guests began moving toward the formal dining room. The seating arrangement had been planned with mathematical precision, ensuring that diplomatic hierarchy was respected while also creating opportunities for meaningful conversation. Catherine found herself seated near several young German politicians and business leaders, while Camilla was placed among the senior statesmen and their wives. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine throughout the multiple courses. Catherine discussed environmental initiatives with a Green Party member of Parliament, her passion for the subject evident in every word. She had been preparing for this topic for weeks, knowing it would resonate with German audiences who took environmental issues seriously. Her knowledge was impressive, her enthusiasm infectious. Meanwhile, Camilla engaged in discussions about literacy programs and domestic violence prevention, causes she had championed for years. Her experience showed in the depth of her knowledge and the practical solutions she suggested. She had visited similar programs across Britain and could speak from genuine experience about what worked and what didn't. President Steinmeier observed both women throughout the evening, making mental notes for his speech. He had originally planned a fairly standard address about friendship between nations and the importance of diplomatic relationships. But as the evening progressed, he found himself genuinely impressed by both royal ladies. Though in different ways, the German media representatives present were already crafting their stories. Royal visits always generated significant interest, but this one felt different somehow. The photographers had captured beautiful images of both women, but there was something about Catherine that seemed to leap off the page. Perhaps it was her youth or the way she connected with younger Germans, or simply the knowledge that she represented the future of the British Monarchy. As the meal concluded and the moment for speeches arrived, a hush fell over the room. This was always the most formal part of any state banquet, when flowery diplomatic language would be used to reinforce friendships and partnerships. The guests settled back in their chairs, wine glasses refilled, ready for the traditional exchange of pleasantries between heads of state. President Steinmeier rose from his seat, looking around the room at the assembled guests. He had delivered hundreds of speeches in his political career, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he had the opportunity to speak not just to the people in the room, but to both nations about the future of their relationship. He had decided to take a slightly different approach than usual, one that would focus on the next generation of leadership rather than dwelling on past achievements. The Queen Consort straightened in her chair, expecting the traditional acknowledgement of her role and status. She had become accustomed to these formal occasions and knew how they typically proceeded. The president would thank her and her husband for their visit, praise their dedication to duty, and express hope for continued cooperation between their countries. Catherine also prepared herself for the formal recognition that protocol demanded. She understood her place in the royal hierarchy and expected to be acknowledged appropriately, but not necessarily as the focus of the evening. That honor belonged to Camilla as the Queen Consort. Neither woman could have anticipated what President Steinmeier was about to say, or how his words would create ripples that would be felt far beyond the walls of Bellevue Palace. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were live, and in a few moments, the president would deliver remarks that would dominate headlines across Europe and beyond. The stage was set for what would become one of the most analyzed royal moments of the year, though none of the participants yet realized the storm that was about to break. President Steinmeier cleared his throat and began his speech with the customary diplomatic pleasantries. The room remained quiet, guests politely attentive as he spoke about the long history of cooperation between Germany and Britain. His voice carried easily through the ornate dining room, amplified by the formal acoustics of the palace's grand spaces. Throughout history, our nations have learned that we are stronger when we work together, the president began, his English clear and carefully pronounced. Tonight we celebrate not just our past achievements, but more importantly, we look toward the future that our countries will build together. The assembled guests nodded approvingly. This was exactly the sort of language they expected from such occasions. Diplomatic, positive, forward-looking. Queen Camilla smiled graciously, prepared for the moment when the president would acknowledge her presence and thank her for the visit. But then, President Steinmeier's speech took an unexpected turn. Instead of following the traditional protocol of addressing the most senior royal first, his eyes moved to Catherine. "Your Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales," he said, his voice gaining warmth and energy. "You represent something truly special to those of us who believe in the power of the next generation to solve the challenges we face." Catherine looked slightly surprised but maintained her composure, offering a gracious smile. Around the room, several guests exchanged glances. This wasn't how these speeches usually went. The Queen Consort should have been acknowledged first, and certainly more prominently. "In our conversations this evening," the president continued, "I have been struck by your passion for environmental protection, your understanding of the challenges facing young people across Europe, and your vision for how our nations can work together to create a more sustainable future. These are not just the concerns of today, but the urgent priorities of tomorrow." The German environmental minister leaned forward, clearly pleased by this direction. She had spent considerable time talking with Catherine earlier in the evening and had been impressed by the princess's knowledge and commitment. This wasn't just royal small talk, but genuine engagement with policy details and practical solutions. President Steinmeier's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theme. "When I look at the future of the relationship between our countries, I see it embodied in leaders like the Princess of Wales, leaders who understand that the challenges we face, climate change, economic uncertainty, social division, require fresh thinking and genuine collaboration between nations." In the audience, several senior German politicians nodded approvingly. The president was striking exactly the right tone for a modern European leader, focusing on substance over ceremony. But those familiar with royal protocol began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Where was the acknowledgement of Queen Camilla's role and status? Catherine herself began to sense that something unusual was happening. She had attended dozens of these formal dinners, and this level of personal attention was unprecedented. She glanced briefly toward Camilla, whose expression remained perfectly composed but whose eyes had grown slightly cooler. "The Princess of Wales has shown us tonight what the future of royal leadership looks like," President Steinmeier declared, raising his glass. "Informed, passionate, connected to the real challenges facing our citizens. When I think about the Britain of tomorrow and the partnership our countries will build, I see a bright future indeed." The German president's words were being broadcast live on German television, and already social media was beginning to buzz. Royal watchers across Europe were taking note of the unusually effusive praise being directed toward Catherine, and the conspicuous absence of similar recognition for the Queen consort. Queen Camilla maintained her diplomatic smile, but those who knew her well could detect the slight tension in her shoulders. She had worked for years to establish herself as a respected member of the royal family, overcoming initial public skepticism and hostility. She had earned her place through dedication and hard work, and these sorts of oversights, intentional or not, struck at the heart of her carefully built position. The British ambassador shifted nervously in his seat. He could already imagine the phone calls he would be receiving from Buckingham Palace tomorrow morning. Royal protocol existed for good reasons, and when it was breached, even inadvertently, it created problems that could last for months. President Steinmeier seemed genuinely unaware of the diplomatic minefield he was wandering through. To him, Catherine represented everything positive about modern royal leadership. She was young, articulate, engaged with contemporary issues, and clearly committed to making a difference. In his mind, she embodied the future of British-German relations in a way that felt fresh and exciting. "I have been particularly impressed," he continued, "by the princess's understanding of the European perspective on climate action. Her questions about our renewable energy initiative showed not just courtesy, but genuine intellectual curiosity about how we can share solutions across borders." The environmental minister beamed, remembering her detailed conversation with Catherine about wind power developments in the north. "See," the princess had asked, thoughtful, questions about German innovations and seemed genuinely interested in how similar projects might work in British waters, but while the German guests were clearly enjoying this focus on future-oriented cooperation, the British contingent was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Royal visits were carefully choreographed events, and when someone, even someone as well-meaning as President Steinmeier, departed from the script, it created complications. Catherine herself was beginning to feel the awkwardness of the situation. She appreciated the president's kind words, but she was also acutely aware that protocol demanded equal, if not greater, recognition for the Queen consort. Her training in royal etiquette had taught her to be sensitive to these dynamics, and she could sense the tension building in the room. The German media representatives were frantically taking notes and checking their cameras. This wasn't the routine royal coverage they had expected. This was a story, and they knew it. Already, they were crafting headlines about the German president's obvious preference for the future Queen over the current one. President Steinmeier raised his glass higher, preparing for his final remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to join me in a toast to the Princess of Wales, whose vision and leadership give us all reason to be optimistic about the future of British-German cooperation." The room rose as one. Glasses raised, but the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. What should have been a moment of celebration felt instead like a diplomatic incident in the making. Catherine stood gracefully, acknowledging the toast with appropriate gratitude, but her eyes showed a hint of concern about what would come next. Queen Camilla also stood, her training taking over even as she processed what had just occurred. Years of royal duty had taught her to maintain composure in any situation, but privately, She was calculating the implications of what had just happened in front of cameras and diplomatic representatives from across Europe. As the guests lowered their glasses after the toast, President Steinmeier seemed to suddenly realize that his speech had focused almost entirely on Catherine. His diplomatic instincts, honed through decades of political service, finally kicked in. He cleared his throat once more, his expression shifting slightly as he attempted to course correct. "And of course," he said, his voice carrying a note of what seemed like afterthought, "we are equally honored to welcome Her Majesty Queen Camilla to Germany." The words felt rushed, almost perfunctory compared to the flowing praise he had lavished on Catherine just moments before. The damage, however, was already done. Every person in that room understood protocol well enough to recognize what had just occurred. The Queen Consort, who should have been the primary focus of the evening's formal remarks, had been relegated to what felt like a footnote in her own state visit. Queen Camilla's training in royal composure served her well. She nodded graciously, her smile never wavering, but those who knew her could see the flash of something harder in her eyes. This wasn't just about protocol or hurt feelings. This was about the careful balance of power and respect that kept the monarchy functioning smoothly. The German president continued his belated acknowledgement. Queen Camilla's dedication to charitable causes and her support for important social issues has been an inspiration to many across Europe. The words were appropriate, but lacked the personal warmth and specific detail that had characterized his remarks about Catherine. Catherine felt the awkwardness acutely. She had spent years learning to navigate the complex dynamics of royal hierarchy, and she understood better than most how damaging this kind of oversight could be to family relationships. She had witnessed firsthand how perceived slights could create lasting tensions. Within the royal household, the British ambassador made a mental note to speak privately with President Steinmeier after the dinner. Diplomatic relations required delicate handling, and while the president's enthusiasm for Catherine was understandable, the protocol breach needed to be addressed. Future state visits depended on maintaining proper respect for royal hierarchy. As dinner concluded and the guests began to mingle again, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Conversations were more animated, with people clearly processing what they had just witnessed. The German media representatives were already composing their reports, knowing they had captured a moment that would generate significant coverage. Dr. Angela Merkel's former chief of staff, now a senior advisor in the German government, approached President Steinmeier quietly. "Herr President," she murmured, "perhaps we should consider how tonight's remarks might be interpreted in the British press tomorrow." The president looked puzzled for a moment. Then his expression showed dawning realization. "You think I may have created a problem?" he asked quietly. "The Princess of Wales is indeed impressive," the advisor replied carefully, "but protocol exists for good reasons. The British take these matters very seriously, and we may need to do some diplomatic repair work." Meanwhile, Catherine found herself surrounded by German guests eager to continue their conversations from dinner. A group of young entrepreneurs wanted to discuss her environmental initiatives, while several university students hoped to share their perspectives on European cooperation. Her natural ability to connect with people was on full display, but she was also conscious of the need to be sensitive to the evening's developments. Queen Camilla, for her part, maintained her royal duties with characteristic professionalism. She engaged warmly with the German dignitaries who approached her, discussing everything from cultural exchanges to agricultural cooperation. Her years of experience showed in her ability to find common ground with anyone, regardless of their background or interests. But the royal protection officers and private secretaries were already in quiet communication. Text messages were being sent to Buckingham Palace, and phone calls were being arranged. This was the kind of incident that required immediate management to prevent it from escalating into a larger diplomatic or public relations crisis. The German television crew, which had been broadcasting portions of the evening live, knew they had captured something significant. The contrast between the president's enthusiastic, detailed praise for Catherine and his brief, formal acknowledgement of Camilla was stark enough that even viewers unfamiliar with royal protocol would notice, social media was already beginning to explode with commentary. Royal watchers across Europe were dissecting every word of the president's speech, with many noting the obvious preference shown for the future queen over the current one. Hashtags were trending, and photo comparisons were being shared showing the different reactions of the two women. The irony wasn't lost on experienced royal observers that Catherine, who had always been careful to show proper deference to her senior royal relatives, was now at the center of a controversy not of her making. Her grace under pressure only seemed to reinforce President Steinmeier's assessment of her as a natural leader. As the evening wound down, the traditional protocol called for brief private conversations between the visiting royals and their host. President Steinmeier first met privately with Queen Camilla, and those watching could see him speaking with obvious earnestness, his body language suggesting he was attempting to address the evening's events. Camilla listened politely, her expression remaining diplomatically neutral. She had dealt with far worse situations over the years and knew how to maintain her dignity while making her displeasure known. When they emerged from their brief conversation, both were smiling. But it was the kind of smile that diplomats recognize as professional rather than genuine. The president's conversation with Catherine was equally brief but carried a different energy. He seemed to be expressing his admiration for her work, while she appeared to be graciously accepting his praise while perhaps suggesting more careful attention to protocol in the future. The British delegation began their preparations to leave, but everyone knew that the real conversations would happen once they returned to their hotel. Royal households have their own ways of dealing with these situations, and tonight's events would require careful management to prevent lasting damage to relationships both within the family and between the two countries. As the state cars pulled up to transport the royal party back to their hotel, photographers captured images that would dominate front pages across Europe the next morning. Catherine looked serene but thoughtful, while Camilla maintained her dignified bearing despite what had been a challenging evening. The German president watched from the palace steps as his distinguished guests departed, finally beginning to understand the full implications of his well-intentioned but diplomatically problematic speech. The royal convoy moved silently through Berlin's illuminated streets, but inside the lead car, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Catherine stared out the window at the passing landmarks, her mind racing through the implications of the evening's events. She had learned long ago that in royal life, perception often mattered more than intention. And tonight's perceptions were problematic. Queen Camilla sat across from her, maintaining perfect posture despite the late hour. Her decades of experience in navigating royal protocol had taught her when to address issues immediately and when to let them settle overnight. Tonight felt like a situation that required careful consideration before any words were spoken. The British ambassador's car followed closely behind, and Sir Sebastian was already on his secure phone with London. These conversations could not wait until morning. The Foreign Office needed to understand what had happened and how it might affect British-German relations going forward. The president seemed genuinely unaware of the protocol implications, he explained quietly to the permanent undersecretary. But the coverage is going to be significant. We need to consider our response carefully. Back at Bellevue Palace, President Steinmeier was receiving his own briefings from his senior staff. The initial media reaction was already coming in, and it was clear that his speech had created exactly the kind of diplomatic incident that experienced politicians try to avoid. The British press will interpret this as a snub to the Queen consort, his chief of staff explained bluntly, and they won't be entirely wrong. We've inadvertently created a narrative about preference for the future Queen over the current one. The president sat heavily in his office chair, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. His praise for Catherine had been genuine, born of real admiration for her knowledge and commitment. But he was beginning to understand that, in the world of royal protocol, genuine admiration needed to be expressed within carefully defined boundaries. Meanwhile, in their suite at the Hotel Adlon, the royal household staff were working overtime, Private secretaries were monitoring social media, tracking news coverage, and preparing briefing notes for conversations with Buckingham. Palace that would undoubtedly come in the morning, Catherine's lady-in-waiting, found her staring out at the Brandenburg Gate, still wearing her evening gown but having removed her tiara. "Your Royal Highness," she said gently, "perhaps it would be best to get some rest. Tomorrow will likely be a demanding day." Catherine turned from the window, her expression showing the strain of the evening despite her public composure. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "I was simply being myself, engaging with the topics I care about." How did that become controversial? The question hung in the air, highlighting one of the fundamental challenges of modern royal life. Being authentic and engaged was essential for remaining relevant, but it also risked upsetting the delicate balance of hierarchy and protocol that kept the institution functioning. In her own suite, Queen Camilla was having a similar conversation with her private secretary, though from a different perspective. Years of fighting for acceptance and respect within the royal family had taught her to be sensitive to any perceived slights, intentional or otherwise. "The coverage tomorrow will focus on the contrast," her secretary said carefully. "The enthusiastic praise for the Princess of Wales versus the brief acknowledgement of Your Majesty. We need to decide how to respond." Camilla's expression was thoughtful rather than angry. She had survived far worse than a diplomatic faux pas, and she understood better than most that these situations required strategic thinking rather than emotional reactions. "We respond by doing our job," she said finally. "Tomorrow's schedule continues as planned. We show that we're above this kind of drama." But even as she spoke, Camilla knew that the damage went beyond tomorrow's headlines. These moments had a way of crystallizing public perception, of creating narratives that could persist for years. The idea that she was somehow being overshadowed by Catherine was not new, but tonight had given that narrative concrete evidence to point to. The German media was already running with the story. Late-night talk shows were analyzing the president's speech, with royal experts weighing in on the protocol implications. The general consensus was that while President Steinmeier's praise for Catherine was understandable, the execution had been diplomatically tone-deaf. Television producers across Europe were scrambling to book royal experts for morning shows. This was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination, combining royal drama with diplomatic intrigue and the eternal fascination with generational change within the monarchy. The British tabloids, working with their network of royal correspondents and sources, were already preparing their front pages. Headlines were being crafted that would play up the drama, while maintaining plausible deniability about taking sides in what was essentially a family matter. Back in London, Buckingham Palace's communications team was holding an emergency meeting. These situations required delicate handling because any official response risked making the story bigger while potentially creating the impression that there actually was tension between the two royal women. The palace's strategy would likely be to maintain dignified silence while privately working to ensure that future diplomatic events were better managed, but they also knew that silence could be interpreted as confirmation of tensions. Creating a no-win situation, Prince William reached at his country home, listened quietly as his private secretary briefed him on the evening's events. As Catherine's husband and a future king himself, he understood better than most how these seemingly minor protocol breaches could have lasting implications for family relationships. "How is Catherine handling it?" was his first question, followed quickly by, "What's the palace's position?" He knew that his wife would be feeling responsible for something that was entirely outside her control, and that concerned him more than any diplomatic fallout. King Charles, informed of the situation despite the late hour, understood immediately that this was the kind of incident that required his personal attention. As someone who had spent decades navigating the complexities of royal hierarchy, he knew that these matters, if not handled properly, could create lasting divisions within the family. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Catherine, who had always been scrupulous about showing proper respect to her senior royal relatives, was now at the center of a controversy that portrayed her as somehow competitive with, or threatening to Queen Camilla. As Berlin slept, the royal household staff continued their work, preparing briefings, monitoring coverage, and planning responses to what was already shaping up to be a significant royal story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the state visit continued, but with the added complexity of managing the fallout from tonight's unexpected diplomatic drama. The question now was whether this would be remembered as a minor protocol breach that was quickly forgotten, or whether it would become one of those defining moments that shaped public perception of the relationship between the current queen consort and the future queen for years to come. Dawn broke over Berlin, with newspaper headlines that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions of the British diplomatic team. "Future Queen outshines Camilla at state dinner," screamed the tabloids, while more serious publications ran analytical pieces about the implications of President Steinmeier's breach of protocol. The German press was equally fascinated, though their coverage tended to focus more on their president's obvious admiration for Catherine rather than any perceived slight to Camilla. "Steinmeier charmed by Wales princess," read one headline, accompanied by photos of the president's animated conversation with Catherine during dinner. At the British Embassy, Sir Sebastian Wood was fielding calls from journalists, palace officials, and government ministers before his morning coffee had even cooled. The overnight coverage had been extensive, and the story was gaining momentum rather than fading away as everyone had hoped. "The German government is prepared to issue a clarifying statement," he reported during an emergency conference call with London. "But we need to be careful that any attempt to clarify doesn't just draw more attention to the original problem." Back at the Hotel Adlon, both royal households were dealing with their own morning challenges. Catherine's schedule for the day included visits to a renewable energy research facility and a meeting with young entrepreneurs, events that had been planned months in advance, but now carried additional weight, given the previous evening's focus on her future leadership role. Her private secretary approached her carefully during breakfast. "Your Royal Highness, there's been considerable overnight coverage of the President's remarks. We've prepared some guidance on how to handle questions from the press." Catherine set down her teacup with a slight sigh. I suppose it would be naive to think this would simply disappear overnight. She had hoped that a good night's sleep might provide perspective, but the morning headlines made clear that this story had taken on a life of its own. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, was taking a different approach. Her decades of experience had taught her that the best response to this kind of media storm was to continue performing her royal duties with unwavering professionalism. Her schedule included a visit to a women's shelter and a cultural center, engagements that would demonstrate her commitment to the causes she had championed for years. "We proceed exactly as planned," she told her staff firmly. "No changes, no special statements, no acknowledgement that anything unusual has occurred. We are here to represent the crown, and that's what we'll do." The German government was scrambling to manage their own portion of the crisis. President Steinmeier's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing deep respect for both Her Majesty Queen Camilla and Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, but the damage control felt forced and only served to keep the story in the headlines. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock found herself in the awkward position of having to discuss royal protocol during what should have been routine meetings about trade and security cooperation. The diplomatic fallout was minor but embarrassing. Exactly the kind of self-inflicted wound that experienced politicians try to avoid. As the morning progressed, royal experts across Europe were being interviewed on television and radio, offering their analysis of what the previous evening's events meant for the future of the British monarchy. The consensus seemed to be that while no lasting damage had been done, the incident highlighted the ongoing transition within the royal family. Professor Sarah Gristwood, a respected royal historian, summed up the situation during a BBC interview. "What we saw last night was an inadvertent glimpse into the future. President Steinmeier responded to Catherine as the monarch she will one day become, rather than respecting the hierarchy as it exists today. It's understandable but diplomatically problematic. The social media reaction was equally intense, with royal watchers dissecting every facial expression and gesture captured by the cameras. Slow-motion replays of Camilla's reactions during the speech were being shared widely, with amateur lip readers claiming to decode her private thoughts. Catherine's first public appearance of the day came at the Renewable Energy Facility, where German researchers were eager to show off their latest innovations in wind and solar technology. Despite the media circus surrounding her arrival, she managed to focus completely on the presentations, asking detailed questions that demonstrated genuine engagement with the subject matter. The contrast with the media narrative was striking. Here was Catherine doing exactly what had impressed President Steinmeier the previous evening, showing real intellectual curiosity and commitment to important policy issues. Yet now these same qualities were being portrayed as somehow threatening to established royal hierarchy. Dr. Klaus Weber, the facility's director, was oblivious to the morning's headlines when he began his presentation. Your Royal Highness, your reputation for environmental advocacy preceded you, and we're thrilled to share our work with someone who truly understands these challenges. Catherine smiled graciously, but several members of her entourage exchanged glances. Even well-intentioned comments now carried additional weight, potentially reinforcing the narrative about her exceptional qualities that had caused last night's problems. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's visit to the women's shelter was proceeding with characteristic warmth and professionalism. She spent considerable time speaking privately with residents, listening to their stories and offering encouragement. Her genuine empathy and years of experience working with vulnerable populations were evident in every interaction. The shelter's director was clearly moved by Camilla's engagement. Your Majesty, the women here will remember this visit for years to come. Your willingness to hear their stories and offer hope means more than you can know. But even this positive coverage was being filtered through the lens of the previous evening's events. Royal correspondents were noting the contrast between Camilla's substantial charitable work and the lack of recognition it had received in President Steinmeier's speech. The British tabloids were having a field day with the story, playing up every angle they could find. Camilla's humiliation competed with Kate's triumph on newsstands, while online coverage included detailed analysis of body language, fashion choices, and social media engagement. The palace's communications team was monitoring everything, trying to gauge whether their strategy of dignified silence was working or whether more active management was needed. The risk was that any official comment would only add fuel to the fire, but allowing misleading narratives to persist had its own dangers. Prince William called Catherine during a brief break in her schedule. "How are you holding up?" he asked, concern evident in his voice despite the secure phone connection. "I keep thinking about how this affects the family," Catherine replied quietly. "Camilla has worked so hard to earn her place, and now, through no fault of either of us, it looks like there's some kind of competition between us." This was exactly what palace officials had feared. The story was no longer just about diplomatic protocol, but was being interpreted as evidence of tensions within the royal family itself, potentially creating actual problems where none had existed before. By the afternoon of their final day in Berlin, it became clear that the story was not going to fade quietly away. International media had picked up the coverage, with American networks running segments about royal drama in Berlin and French publications analyzing the implications for European monarchy more broadly. The turning point came during an unexpected moment at the state visit's final official engagement. Both Catherine and Queen Camilla were attending the reopening of a restored historical building that symbolized British-German cooperation. The event had been planned as a routine ribbon-cutting ceremony, but the media presence was enormous due to the ongoing coverage. As they arrived at the venue, photographers captured every angle, searching for any sign of tension between the two women. But what they witnessed instead was a masterclass in royal professionalism and genuine mutual respect. When Queen Camilla's car door was opened by a young German protocol officer who seemed nervous about the media attention, Catherine was the first to notice his discomfort. She quietly stepped forward and, with a gentle smile, said something that made him laugh and visibly relaxed. Camilla, observing this small act of kindness, felt a familiar surge of admiration for her daughter-in-law's natural ability to put people at ease. Whatever the media was saying about competition between them, she knew that Catherine's character was fundamentally generous and thoughtful during the ceremony itself. An opportunity arose that would ultimately reshape the entire narrative. The building's restoration had been supported by a joint, charitable initiative that combined Camilla's literacy programs with Catherine's environmental advocacy. The project director, unaware of the media storm, enthusiastically described how the two women's different but complementary approaches had made the project possible, Your Majesties. Focus on reading programs for disadvantaged children provided the educational foundation, the director explained, while Your Royal Highness's environmental initiatives helped us create a sustainable learning space. Together you've created something neither could have achieved alone. This simple statement crystallized what palace officials had been trying to communicate all along. The two women weren't competitors but collaborators, each bringing unique strengths to their shared mission of service. Camilla seized the moment with the political instinct she had developed over decades. The Princess of Wales brings such passion and knowledge to environmental issues, she said warmly, making sure her words were clearly audible to the assembled media. I've learned so much from working alongside her on projects like this. Catherine, understanding immediately what Camilla was doing, responded in kind. Queen Camilla's experience and wisdom have been invaluable to me since joining the royal family. Her dedication to literacy and supporting vulnerable women has been an inspiration for my own work. The photographers captured the genuine warmth between the two women as they toured the facility together, pointing out features of the restoration and discussing the children's programs with obvious shared enthusiasm. The body language told a completely different story from the previous evening's awkwardness. President Steinmeier, who had joined them for this final event, watched with visible relief as the two women demonstrated their actual relationship. His chief of staff whispered quietly, "Herr President, I think they may have just solved our diplomatic problem." The German leader took his cue, offering brief remarks that praised both women equally and specifically highlighted their collaborative work. "Yesterday evening I spoke about the future of royal leadership," he said carefully. "Today, I see that future embodied not in competition but in cooperation between two remarkable women who complement each other's strengths." The media coverage began shifting almost immediately. Instead of stories about rivalry and protocol breaches, journalists found themselves writing about royal teamwork and the different but equally valuable contributions each woman made to their shared responsibilities. Social media sentiment changed just as quickly. Royal watchers who had been analyzing every gesture for signs of tension now shared clips of the two women laughing together and clearly enjoying each other's company. The hashtag royal teamwork began trending, replacing the more divisive tags from the previous day. Back in London, palace officials watched the coverage with cautious optimism. The crisis hadn't been manufactured by palace communications, but had been resolved by the genuine relationship between the two principals. This was always the strongest foundation for any royal narrative. Authenticity rather than spin. As their plane lifted off from Berlin that evening, both women felt the relief of a diplomatic crisis averted and a relationship preserved. The uncomfortable spotlight of the previous evening had ultimately revealed something positive about their working partnership and mutual respect. Catherine reflected on how quickly media narratives could shift, creating problems where none existed but also potentially recognizing genuine strengths and relationships. The experience had reinforced her understanding that royal life required constant vigilance about perception, but also that authentic relationships could ultimately overcome temporary misunderstandings. Queen Camilla, for her part, felt that the incident had actually strengthened her position by demonstrating her ability to handle challenging situations with grace, while also showcasing the genuine warmth of her relationship with Catherine. The media storm had passed, But the lesson about the power of collaboration over competition would endure. President Steinmeier issued a final statement as the royal plane departed German airspace. This state visit has demonstrated the strength that comes from combining experience with innovation, tradition with fresh perspectives. We look forward to continuing our partnership with both the current and future generations of British royal leadership. The story that had begun with an inadvertent protocol breach had evolved into something more positive. A reminder that even in an institution as formal and hierarchical as the monarchy, genuine relationships and shared purpose could overcome temporary diplomatic awkwardness. In the weeks that followed, the Berlin incident would be remembered not as a moment of tension between two royal women, but as evidence of their professional partnership and mutual respect. The crisis had revealed character rather than creating division, ultimately strengthening both women's positions within the royal family and, in public perception, the lesson for future diplomatic engagements was clear: protocol mattered, but authentic relationships mattered more. President Steinmeier's initial misstep had created a temporary problem, but the gracious response of both royal women had turned a potential crisis into a demonstration of the very leadership qualities he had tried to praise in the first place.